The symbol on the screen is actually from a competition that was run recently by the International Union of Architects. It's an accessibility symbol, and it's a circle kind of showing an open door. And we've got symbols for accessibility already. We see wheelchairs, we see there's a person in a blue circle often used, but I love this new symbolism, the idea of opening doors, because to me, that's what accessibility is all about. It's about opening doors for people, giving them access to not just services, but like education, healthcare, jobs, all the things that you need in order to survive in society today. I wanted to kick off with a little bit of an accessibility story. The day before my flight from Toronto to San Francisco, my hearing aid broke. So I'm disabled, and I do wear hearing aids in both of my ears. I have like a moderate to severe hearing loss, and a hearing aid isn't a thing you can just get like right away. It's kind of like prescription glasses. You got to order them. You got to wait a couple of weeks. So I'm like, oh no, what do I do? There's no way I'm getting another hearing aid. So you know what? I'm just going to rely on lip reading more than I usually do, and I'm just going to make things work. And then 2 days before this talk, my trackpad on my laptop, my Windows laptop, it broke. It's not completely broken, but I thought, oh no, now what? Do I have to go out and buy a mouse? And then I realized, well, lots of people use a computer without a mouse or a trackpad, and I do it all the time when I'm testing. So I'll just figure out how to use the computer without it fully functioning, and so I did. And it's fine. The point of the story is your level of disability can change at any time. You can run into all kinds of complications, whether you're disabled or not, and things just stop working. And when you have a disability, a lot of your life is about just figuring things out and making it work, right? There's all kinds of things out there that are barriers for you in life, and you just gotta, not give up. But the truth is, people like you, people who are building and designing digital products, they can help make that easier for people who have disabilities. So I'm really thrilled that you're here to hear this talk about how do we scale up accessibility in an organization. So for 20 years, I've worked as a designer, as a front-end developer, and in leadership roles. Always with a focus on accessibility. That's always been this common thread throughout my career. And recently, I've worked in organizations that had really large digital teams, whether I was part of that organization or supporting that organization through consulting. So working with teams of 50 or more people strictly working on digital. And so I've learned a lot about what works and what doesn't, and how do you do accessibility at a larger scale. And that's what this talk is going to be about. It's not when you're just one person or on a small team, how do you do accessibility? That's actually a lot easier than doing it in a larger organization. I want to talk about some of the hard ways to do accessibility first. So the first one, you build a product, you check it for accessibility, maybe you bring in an outside consultant and they do an audit or something like that. And then you realize you've got all kinds of accessibility barriers. So you create a backlog of accessibility things to fix, and you go through and you rebuild your product piece by piece and try to make it accessible. That's not super efficient. The other way to do it, build a product, and maybe you get sued because it's not accessible. Or even if you don't get sued, you get a complaint from a customer. Maybe it's even a letter from a lawyer. And so you can either spend money fighting this lawsuit, or maybe there's lots of back and forth with the lawyers and this customer. Either way, whether you win or lose, you're still going to lose something in your reputation for not having had an accessible product. So most likely you're going to have that big backlog of things to fix, and you're going to be going and rebuilding your product piece by piece again. Again, not the most efficient way to do things. And the last way, but still a hard way to do accessibility, is to build with accessibility in mind. Bear with me here. But so you think you've followed all the guidelines for accessibility, and you think you've built an accessible product, you roll it out, people use it, and then you realize they're still complaining. It's still not actually user-friendly, because the truth is, just following the guidelines isn't enough. If you're never testing with users, you don't know how usable that product actually is for somebody with a disability. So again, you're going back to square one, you've got your backlog of issues, and you're trying to fix and rebuild your product piece by piece. And I know these are the hard ways to do accessibility because I've done all of them in my career. It's from the mistakes we make that we learn. And the truth is, even if you do rebuild your product piece by piece, and now you think you've had an accessible product, it's going to become inaccessible again if you don't have the practices in place to keep it accessible. Products change all the time. They're not static anymore. Everyone's constantly working on new features and new designs and everything like that. So you really need to have a way to do accessibility continuously, because we need to have processes in place that are scalable. What I mean by at scale is at the required size to solve the problem. And that's what we're not doing right now with accessibility. We've got like little pockets of people working on it, but we don't have this big picture of how do you scale something through an entire organization so that all your product, all of your features are accessible all of the time. And how you do that is you actually have to incrementally change your product development process. And what you want to do is create a practice of inclusion within your organization. And a lot of people try to do this like, big change where everything's going to be accessible all at once, but it doesn't work that way. Not in a big organization. You really do have to move incrementally, because you're going to have to bring people on board. You're going to have to change your existing processes. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. In order to really do accessibility at scale in an organization, it needs to fit into all of your processes. So you need to consider accessibility when you're planning, when you're doing research, when you're designing, when you're developing, and even in customer support, which is something that a lot of people don't think about. So I'm going to talk about all those different parts of the process and how you can fit accessibility into each one of them. But the reality is organizations do need to change the way they design and build products in order to make them more accessible. They need to start bringing tools, accessibility testing tools, into the product development lifecycle. And more importantly, actual people with disabilities have to become part of it. If you're going to do inclusive design, you need to include those users with disability. Because remember, the point of accessibility is to make something that's usable for people with disabilities. And the same way you can't do user experience without users, you can't do accessibility without disabled users. And that's the missing thing in most people's accessibility processes. They're not actually engaging with any people with disabilities in order to make more accessible products. You can't really do it for people with disabilities. You have to do it with them. And that's what we're going to focus on. How do we do that in every phase of the product development lifecycle? Now, each phase could be a whole talk unto itself. There's a lot to say. I'm going to give you a high-level overview because I want you to see how all the different pieces fit together to make a process that an organization can use to do accessibility at scale. Starting off with planning. So when you're planning out whatever product feature you're going to build, you really do need to account for accessibility because it's going to affect your budget and it's going to affect your timelines. And you have to have an awareness of, we're going to set aside that time from the beginning. Before we even start, we're going to make that time to do accessibility. Other things you might need to do in your planning is start by writing user stories for accessibility. That's something I don't see a lot of teams doing. Thinking about really, what are those users that you're going to need to have accessibility in place for, and writing those user stories. So an example of a user story is, as a low vision user, I want high contrast text so that I can read it without changing my magnification setting. Because the reality is, the internet is just full of gray text on a white background. And I know everyone thinks it looks great and they don't want to use black on white. You don't have to go full on black on white, but we can't have this shades of gray on a white background, which really makes it hard for people to see. And by having a user story up front in your planning process, you've already started planning that you're going to be doing that and doing it properly. Another thing you can do during planning is writing accessibility requirements and saying, okay, this product is going to have these requirements for accessibility. The point is just to document something about accessibility so you know that you've worked it into your planning. The other thing you might want to consider is who's going to be accountable for accessibility, because really everybody on the team needs to, but that's the sort of thing you can plan and decide on up front. So for example, this is a poster I developed early on in my career, and accessibility really is a team sport. Everyone, even the client who, if you're building a product for a client, needs to have some sort of participation in accessibility. Clients need to be supportive of it. Project managers need to budget time for it. Researchers need to make sure they're working with people with disabilities. Your product owner need to ensure, accountability for accessibility is assigned to people, and so on and so forth. So all these different roles need to come together, and they all have a part to play. If anyone is not supporting accessibility, you're going to have a gap in the end result of your product. That's another one of those symbols from that competition where they were redesigning that accessibility symbol. And it's a bit of an X with dots, kind of symbolizing people working together and just inclusion as a whole. So let's talk about beyond planning. What do you do if you're a researcher or you're on a research team? How are you involved in accessibility? Well, one of the things that people need to start doing is generative research, and that's where you're starting to learn about people's needs, the user needs of people with disabilities, especially those who are using assistive technology. So any kind of software or hardware that people use as an interface to access the internet could be considered assistive technology. In generative research, you can ask people about their assistive technology, how they interact, do they change their browser setting, do they change their mobile setting, and you're learning about any specific challenges that they might have. So if you ask somebody, when you're on the internet, what are the things that cause you trouble all the time? One of the things I hear constantly is CAPTCHAs. If you're blind, how do you get past the CAPTCHA? And just learning about those things up front so that before you build your product, before you design your product, you already know what these users' needs are. And you can also ask them about what are the really good experiences that they've had. And in that way, you're sort of involving people with disabilities in almost a co-design exercise, because you're really helping them help you to plan out how you're going to design and build your product or feature. And I've got an example here of a generative research session. Sheetal is a screen magnification user, and her and I were talking about some of those good experiences that she's had with accessibility in the real world. In this case, it was kind of a bad experience that turned into a good experience. And then we started talking about how it could have been designed differently. So I'm going to run this clip for you.
Recently I went to a doctor's appointment for some testing for my blood work. And then my number, I had a number. They usually give you a number, right? Yeah. There's a number card. So I knew my number, what my number was, but the number was there was a TV screen, and there was a number was coming there as your turn was approaching. Usually, as we have what do we call when you wait for the time and there are particular windows where you have to go. Yeah. So I was having trouble. I was just using my phone and trying to look at the screen. So there was a lady who just noticed me, and then she saw the number on my card. And as soon as the number was there, she said, "It's your turn." So that was really, that really touched me. I never asked for help, but then she noticed and she told me. So I really appreciated that.
That's nice. I have the opposite problem. I can't hear when they announce the numbers, and if they have it on a
screen, yeah. So I feel it's very important that we should have both the, the some things where you can see and hear as well.
That's a really important insight at the end there. Like her and I were talking about how she needs to hear the announcements. I said I need to see the announcements, and then she started talking about, well, you really need to do both. And those are the kinds of things that you might not think of yourself, and you can plan for that when you're designing and building products, when you get that early insight. And so people do a lot of usability testing with disabled people, but they don't often do that kind of like upfront generative research, which I think is really important to include. So beyond research, what do you do in the design phase? One of the things I like to see people do is to do prototype reviews with people with disabilities. So if you're working, whether it's an interactive prototype or even just a wireframe, you can have a research session with somebody who has accessibility needs, walk them through your plans and get their feedback very early on. And in fact, I challenge you to go beyond just asking them for feedback on your designs and saying, how would you design this? Knowing what we want to do here, what would you recommend that we do? And you can really learn a lot of those early insights. And it's so much easier to figure out what you're going to do to make something accessible when you're that early planning phase and you haven't really finalized your designs rather than going back and changing things later. Other things you can do with that accessibility to your design system, that's kind of a given. We all talk about that nowadays, but making sure your components, your color palettes, all of those things are accessible. And then something that people don't do very commonly, but I'd love to see more of, is so much of accessibility is pushed onto the developers. But when you're doing your design specs as a designer, you really should be adding accessibility annotation there. I would encourage designers to start specifying what the focus order is on their design, so numbering things, to say, here's the first tab stop, here's the second tab stop, including your headings and your heading levels, including any alt text for images, labels for form fields, specifying all of that stuff. And there's some really great toolkits out there. There's the Accessibility Blue Lines, which is probably the oldest annotation kit, and it works for Figma and I believe Sketch as well. But I think almost everybody nowadays is on Figma. The two that I really like, Indeed has an accessibility annotation kit, and it's got lots more detail on how to use the various assets than the Blue Lines kit does. And then Twitter has one that's really nice as well. And what's nice about the Twitter one is they have different assets for both light mode and dark mode, and they also have a set of assets that you can use if you're marking up a website or web app, and then they also have native app annotations as well. And then they also have an example of how they've done an annotation on one of their Twitter screens. So like showing you how they've used the tab stop, the headings, and the labels, and all of that. So it's not too hard when you're working with a kit to start incorporating those things into your design. And that can become part of your handover process to the developers. Now, if you're an actual developer, front-end developer, there are two main ways that you can bring accessibility into your work. One is to use automated tools, which I think are pretty common nowadays. And the second is users, actually working with users. And that's something that's really uncommon. Most developers have never actually spoken to a screen reader user or an alternative navigation user or a screen magnification user. So when you're not doing that, you're trying to figure out, okay, we have the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, we have ARIA, how do I put this all together? I'm going to follow all the rules and hope for the best. But you really learn so much if you spend some time talking to those people who are using those technologies every day. If they are, a lot of them are very technical, especially screen reader users. Some of them will have a coding background, and they can actually give you advice about specifically how you might code this component to make it work for them. If we're talking about those automated tools, there are obviously, I think the most common one is the browser extensions. My favorite would be the Axe accessibility testing tools, and then also Wave is pretty good as well. If you have a continuous integration pipeline, there are a lot of tools that you can incorporate there. Pally, P-A-11Y, is one of them. Axe also does everything. They have tools that work with a CI pipeline for React, Jest, Mocha, like anything you can think of, Axe has something that integrates with it. And then there's code linters. And so the code linters are actually going to be checking for accessibility as you're writing the code, which is like the earliest point of time where you can start to find those issues. There's a good one called ESLint. Axe also has one. Axe has everything when it comes to automated testing. And there's another one called AccessLint as well. And then if you're lucky enough to be in an organization where you actually have accessibility specialists, you can have them do some user acceptance testing, sort of a mini audit, just to make sure you've used everything properly. So as a developer, there's still so many ways you can incorporate accessibility without having all the burden of the work be on you, to have all this knowledge and all this understanding of the accessibility guidelines.
There are special shortcut keys for moving through a table. So I'm going to be using that. Essentially, it's Control Alt, left, right, up and down arrows. So I'm just going to do down arrow first.
Row 2.
All right, so we're in these are row titles, or row headers.
Data row 12 p.m., row 6 p.m., row 8 p.m., rows bottom of column.
Right.
12, 8, 6 time, row 1.
That's fine. So then that's the column header right there, which is time. And then it goes
Monday, column 2, Tuesday, Wednesday, column Thursday, Friday, column 6, Saturday, column Sunday, column 8.
And there we go.
Saturday,
We have the whole
Wednesday,
week.
Time, beginning of row.
All right, so let's go see. I'm going to be looking for adaptive yoga. So I'm going to go
6 a.m., row 2.
find out. I'm an early riser. I'm going to see if there's any adaptive yoga on this row.
Ashtanga yoga, Ashtanga yoga, Ashtanga yoga, Ashtanga, 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 and the row.
There is not. Let's go to,
Bikram yoga, row 3.
I think it was 8 a.m. I can't remember now. So now I have to go back.
Beginning of row. Bikram 8 a.m., column 1.
8 a.m. Okay, so there's nothing at 6. Let's look at 8.
Bikram yoga, Bikram yoga, Bikram yoga, Bikram yoga, Bikram yoga, Bikram yoga, and the row.
No, there is not. So let's go down one more.
Adaptive, row 4.
Oh, we have an adaptive, but I don't know what time it's at, because the row header is not labeled. So again,
Beginning of row. 12 p.m. column 1.
I moved left, and now it's 12 p.m. If that was actually coded, I'd be able to go
Vinyasa yoga, column 2.
up
Bikram yoga,
and then
Vinyasa yoga, row 4.
down, and it would tell me
12 p.m. column
you're
1.
on the 12 p.m. Row. So let's go find the adaptive. I heard there was 2 there.
Vinyasa yoga, adaptive, column 3.
One there.
Vinyasa yoga, adaptive, column 8.
Oh,
And the
there's
row.
actually 3. So, but on what days? So this is where, if the column headers had been properly coded, I'd be able to move around, and it would say Sunday,
Vinyasa yoga, column 7.
Saturday,
Adaptive, column 6.
Friday. So right now I'm counting. So I think it's Friday, but I'm not sure. So let's go look.
Bikram yoga, Ashtanga, Friday, row 1.
That is Friday.
Ashtanga, Bikram yoga, adaptive, row 4.
But again, to make my life easier, if those headers had been coded correctly, I wouldn't need to go back and forth that much, because it would tell me,
Vinyasa yoga, column 5.
Thursday,
Vinyasa yoga, column 4.
Vinyasa yoga, and then it would be on Wednesday. So then I would go up one,
Bikram yoga, row 3.
and it would tell me, now I don't even remember what time I'm at. I think 10. So let's go
Beginning of
look.
row. Bikram 8 a.m.
No,
column
see,
1.
I was on 8 a.m. So coding the headers properly makes my life much easier, and it's just more efficient. And I'm always looking for efficiencies.
And so the last part of the process of doing accessibility at scale is something that we often don't think of, is customer support. So if you have a product that is actually accessible enough to be used by people with disabilities, which a lot of people, quite frankly, don't, not yet. They're hoping to get there. But let's say you do have customers who are using it and they have complaints about the accessibility of your product. You need to have some sort of pipeline from those complaints to the product team, because they often get lost. They go to, your customer support, customer success, and they don't know what to do with them. And they really need to be connected to the product team, because these are the insights from real users that you need to understand how to do accessibility. So one of the ways you can kind of encourage people to give you that feedback is you can write an accessibility statement. Nature magazine actually has a really good one. I mean, it seems obscure, but if you go to nature.com and you look in their footer, they have an accessibility statement. They talk about their commitment to accessibility, which different types of assistive technology they support, so that anyone visiting, the site will know what's expected to work, what's not. They talk about which version of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines they comply with, so people also have that knowledge. But I think the most important thing they do on their accessibility statement is at the very bottom of it, they have contact information. And they say, if you're having an accessibility issue or challenge with our site, here's how you reach us. And that's funneled separately than all of your other customer support inquiries, so that you've got that dedicated channel. And then what you can do with that is make sure in your issue tracking system you've got labels for accessibility, so that you can maybe make a dashboard of all your accessibility tickets, or some way of tracking those separate from the rest of your issues. Another thing that I've seen company do that's really cool is sometimes they'll create accessibility bug bashing days. So maybe it's once a month or once a quarter, where everybody just sets aside the time and says, okay, we're going to go through all of the tickets in the backlog that are tagged accessibility, and we're going to try to fix as many of them as we can. We've got like a limited time period, and we're all just going to go at it all at once. And that's where, again, if you have an accessibility specialist on the team, they can really help you with triaging that and prioritizing that. So it's kind of like an orchestra. You've got your whole team with all these different roles, and they all have a part to play. And if they do it well, it all comes together and you create something really beautiful. And in this case, the beautiful thing is an accessible digital product. But where do you start? Right? You've got all these different things you can do to do accessibility at scale. How do you prioritize, and what do you start with? Well, one of my recommendations is to start with projects that are already in progress. So if you've already planning to do an overhaul of your design system, work accessibility into that. If there's a new feature that you're going to be building, work accessibility into that. That's the path of least resistance. Just go with what you're already doing. You can also look at the company culture. Some companies are heavily developer-led, others are heavily design-led. And so if you're in one of those two cultures, you probably want to lean toward either more technical or more design-related accessibility changes, just because that's going to be easier. You can also look at the availability of people, who's free, who actually has the time to work on this, and who has the skills and knowledge about accessibility already. That can be a great starting point. If you've already got, say one team where you've got a couple of people who are familiar with accessibility, start with that team. You've got to really think about the feasibility. So what's going to work for us right now? Because scaling up is not going to happen overnight. It's a process. So pick the easy win to start to show success. Another thing that I've seen work really well is have a single product team work together. In one company, this was a mobile team. And I think it was the iOS mobile team specifically. And they were going to do a whole new overhaul of the app. And they thought, okay, we're going to do it with accessibility in mind. So it was both a project in progress, and we had the availability of people to do it. And that worked really well. And so what? The rest of the other mobile apps, the rest of the website, they couldn't do it at the same degree as this one team. But you've got to start somewhere. So start somewhere where you know you're going to be successful. And the really important thing, if you're going to do any of these kinds of projects, is to frame it as a pilot and talk about it. Because the value comes from telling people in the organization, you got to celebrate your successes and also your lessons learned. So you can't just do accessibility without talking about it, because it's not going to have the same impact. You've got to share. And how do you share? Well, you need some sort of metrics, right? If you're going to need to show improvement and demonstrate that your approach is working, you have to think about what does success actually look like? How are we going to measure it? And then do we have a baseline that we can benchmark again? Because if you don't know how accessible you are right now, how are you going to show that you're actually improving? And the one metric I don't like to use is an accessibility audit. I think they're very expensive, they're time consuming, and they're not easy to understand. So you get a giant audit report. So what? Now what do you do with that? Metrics that I prefer are ones that align with what your organization is already tracking. So for example, if your organization is user experience focused, they might be using the System Usability Scale, or SUS. There's actually an equivalent type of survey for accessibility. It's called the Accessible Usability Scale. And it's a similar type of thing where it's a questionnaire. So you either have to be running user interviews and asking the questions at the end of them, or you need to have a survey running on your site that people will take after they've visited the site and completed a task to get that kind of data. But if you have SUS already, bringing in your accessible usability scale and comparing the two can be a great way to show, how does usability work for two different groups of users. The other thing I like is task completion. You can do this again through user interviews where you have somebody attempt a task and, were they able to do it or not? And you can compare that with people who don't have disabilities too, to kind of get in a sense of, okay, like if somebody doesn't have a disability, the task completion rates for, say, our sign-up form are 100% or nearly 100%. But if you do have a disability, guess what? The task completion rates are dropping to only 60%. And so that's a really easy way for people to say, okay, here's a clear need for improvement. Other metrics you can use are the number of accessibility complaints you're getting from your users. And you can set goals for, say, let's resolve all of our accessibility complaints within a certain number of days, maybe 10 days or whatever's feasible for your organization. You can also track the number of accessibility tickets in your backlog and set a goal for reducing. Let's say maybe you want to reduce the number of accessibility issues by 20% each quarter or something like that. You can also look at your automated test coverage for accessibility if you've got that in place and say, okay, what percentage of our product has this automated test coverage for accessibility? Or you can go to the human aspect and say, okay, what percentage of our product has had user testing with assistive technology users, and aim to have maybe 80% or more test coverage over maybe a period of a year. So a whole bunch of different ways you can measure accessibility and demonstrate improvement. The important part is to actually do that. Now, I wanted to throw a little something out there. Let's say this whole accessibility at scale maybe feels too big for you and beyond what you're capable of doing. If you want to do accessibility, you want to be an accessibility champion, but this, getting the whole organization on board and making this kind of change is too much, what do you do? Well, I want to encourage you to actually not do any hands-on accessibility work. What I want you to spend your time doing is things that are repeatable. So writing documentation on accessibility that other people can use, creating a resource library on accessibility that others can use, showing people how to use testing tools, maybe doing some training, some lunch and learns or something like that. Maybe you want to start an accessibility guild. So put your effort toward the things that are going to have a bigger reach within the organization rather than you alone. Because in a large digital team, one person doing accessibility is not enough. You want to focus on the things that are going to help spread accessibility throughout the organization. And it does feel like herding cats sometimes. It really does, like trying to get everyone in an organization on board. But the truth is you can train a cat. I've trained mine. He knows like 20 different German commands, and he will follow them. The truth is you just have to really pay attention to people's needs. And you're thinking about all the resources and the things they need and the gap that they have and setting them up for success. And people will do the right things if you do that. You just have to be strategic about it. So the very last thing that I wanted to wrap up with is executive buy-in. You really do need that. If you're going to do this whole organization accessibility at scale approach, well, you need somebody in leadership to say, yes, this is a priority for us. And the one thing that consistently works for getting leadership buy-in is when we do a video clip of a person with a disability trying to use the product and not being able to, struggling and having difficulties. When you show a clip like that, it only has to be a minute or 2 minutes in length, and maybe you've got a handful of them. If you can get executives to watch something like that, they understand. They understand why it's important, why we need to do this, and it creates empathy in a way that no amount of metrics or KPIs or, trying to convince them ever will.
You'll recognize if you could sum up how the experience today made you feel in one word, not with me, but with the experience that we talked through, what one word would you use?
Trying to think of that one. Hold on. Inspired. There we go.
Inspired. Tell me why.
Only because I like to improve things, and this is sort of a neat little situation where we can just talk about what would make things better instead of telling people this is what you did wrong.
Yeah.
It's kind of fun.
I challenge you to actually inspire the people with disabilities in the world. So it's kind of a flip, because often we look to people with disabilities and think, oh, they're so inspiring. But no, I want you to be the ones inspiring them by building accessible products, by designing accessible products. And let's do it at the scale that is needed to actually remove all those barriers that are in product today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kat. So let me bring up the Google Doc. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating and plugging in some questions in there. So let's explore what questions we have right here. Live, like almost, right? It feels exciting. Well, it's always like all the things that you mentioned, especially like showing the video clips. This is the magical thing for me.
It is.
Because I do it kind of from the usability perspective, like more like usability sessions, people not finding a way for navigation, things like that. But this always works. This is incredible. So let's take a look at some of the things here as well, just so we have that. So we have plenty of questions that came up here. That's great. Here is one which was interesting. I'm going to prioritize your questions because they're more important than mine. One of them is here. Do you think it's more important to make your color palette 100% accessible, or is it enough to include a way to view the site in high contrast mode?
I think probably rather than either of those, I would want to test the site in high contrast mode, like Windows high contrast mode, because a lot of people who are low vision are using Windows, and they're already setting their system settings for high contrast mode. So sometimes people think they need to do a different theme, which you can. Dark mode, a lot of people who are low vision really appreciate having a dark mode, but making sure for those people who have actually set their Windows high contrast mode that you look at what your site looks like. And there's a couple different variations of it. There's like a black on white and a white on black, and it changes the link colors and things to like yellow and cyan. And oftentimes things just like become invisible in high contrast mode. So that's what I would encourage you to do, is to like test that.
Okay. Now that came up also about the games and VR experiences. Do you have any knowledge of how accessible they are and how making them accessible differs from making interfaces accessible?
Yeah, VR is a tricky one. There are some people out there who are writing about accessible VR. It's not my personal area of expertise, but the truth is there is it's always about actually working with the users and getting their feedback. And there is a playbook. There's a playbook for, I'm trying to think. There it is. It's the PEAT, P-E-A-T, Accessibility Playbook for Emerging Technology. And so what that is a framework for anything new, whether it's VR or AI or anything like that. It's processes to follow in order to make things accessible.
Right. Oh, more questions coming in. Well, thank you so much for this. By the way, if you just want to participate as well and bring up the questions, smash.by/rock. This is where we gather all of them. Here's an interesting one. Are there any levels of accessibility to classify product service? Now we have AA, AAA.
Yeah. Yeah, but
that-
I think the metric that I talked about, like task completion,
Yeah.
is such an obvious one. And then the accessible usability scale, which gives you a number on a point scale from 0 to 100 to say, like if you looked at the average for system usability scale, it's around 68. So that's what an average user would rate the experience. And then you could take your accessible usability scale and say, okay, we tested with maybe 10, 20 users, and the average number came out at, let's say it came out at 50. So it's lower than what we would expect the average for the system usability scale. So looking at metrics like that rather than WCAG level A, double A, which is important, but when it comes to selling accessibility and explaining the changes made in a product, it's not great for that.
Yeah, so it's funny that you're saying that because right now I'm working on a product with a team, and the system usability score is 7.5. Right? So that's really, really, really hard to get anything done. So from 7.5 to 70 or so, or 68, this is quite a journey. And one thing that has become very important in the conversation with the team is, can we even make it AAA? Like, is it even viable in that kind of environment? It's a big site, like 100 plus sites within that site, legacy and everything you ever wanted. So would you say that actually getting AAA, right, is it, I mean, when is it viable? Or is it something that we should all be striving for? Or is AA kind of okay too?
I think AA is a great standard to aim for. AAA, like there are lots of things you do for AAA that will make it more accessible for one group of users and less for others. So if you're aiming for AAA, you're gonna probably need some sort of customization for certain users to turn certain things on or off. And that's like where I think the real advances in accessibility are, when you offer dark mode and light mode, and you're making sure that they can change their font settings, and there's some sort of adaptation that's targeted towards people with disability to choose exactly what works for them.
Okay. There's also one here. I'm not sure if I'm not familiar. What are your thoughts on Reach UI components?
There are very few framework components out there that are fully accessible, even the ones that say they are accessible, because when you start actually testing them, you often do run into issues. So I won't comment on a particular framework, but I will say you really do need to, you can't take at face value what they say about accessibility. If they go into real detail about how they tested, that's a good sign, because don't just say you're accessible, but what did you actually test that component with? Did you test it with a screen reader? How many? Which ones? Did you test it with keyboard only? Look for those kinds of details, and that will help you decide if it's really an accessible component library.
Right, right. There's also one, we could just do this forever, I think. At this point.
I could too.
Yeah, but we only have a few minutes left, and I want us all to have a nice break as well. But here's the one which I think is actually quite interesting. Accessibility of Amazon Echo, Google Voice, voice-controlled interfaces and all, or gesture-controlled interfaces, like swiping, zooming, etc. Especially things like maps or data visualization. Where are we there? Is it...
I think the voice control interfaces are quite accessible for certain types of disabilities. So people who are blind, people who have limited mobility, being able to control things by voice and give those kinds of commands is super easy. People who can't hear, like me, I have no idea what my device is saying to me when I talk to it. The gesture ones are really tricky. Whenever anyone is doing gesture-oriented type navigation, I really like to always see some sort of fallback. If you're using an app and you've got a swipe to delete, make sure you also have a little delete icon, because not everyone's going to be able to swipe, or screen reader users are swiping just to navigate, so it's going to conflict with the gestures that they use to actually use their phone. So you always need those fallbacks.
Yeah, and also, I don't know, how many of you actually are watching movies with subtitles on just by default? Oh, right.
Me, of course.
And I remember maybe 10, 15 years ago, it was an exception. Right now, I cannot even imagine watching. I mean, I want to hear, I want to understand everything. Every comma, every full stop, every dash.
I have a statistic on that. That's actually really interesting. So in Canada, the number of people who have a hearing impairment and actually need captions is around 5% of the population. But Netflix did a study as to how many people actually use them, never mind who needs it. And it was 80% plus use captions, at least one. So if we look at accessibility purely from a disability perspective, it's narrow. But then when you think of it from a user need perspective and who might actually benefit from that, that's also a great way to get buy-in, because people think this is just like a small audience, but it's actually not.
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
a huge audience if you frame it that way.
Yeah, or if you're just on the go somewhere on a mobile phone, you don't
Yeah.
want to have your headphones on or whatever, you just can follow along as well.
Yeah.
Right, I mean, the last question, I mean, we can really go this forever. You've been doing a lot of different work. So what do you say is the biggest challenge or the most complicated project which you ever had in terms of accessibility work?
I think it's actually the small things that are hard to get right. And one of the things that people are doing all the time is they're making custom components. So like the default native HTML form elements, they're not pretty. Nobody likes to select. Everyone builds their own, and then they don't build it to be accessible.
Right.
They don't understand all of the different nuances as to
Yep.
how to make. If you're going to make something custom, it has to be as accessible as the native HTML default. And the answer to that is there's this huge library of WAIA, WAI-ARIA, best practices. And they kind of outline for every single component you can imagine, what are the keyboard interactions, what does the screen reader need to hear. So it's really underutilized. It's one of the W3C resources, so it's not super pretty and it's hard to read, but it's good stuff if you can force yourself to get through it.
All right, well, with this in mind, I think there is so much we can cover, and if you have any questions, you will find Kate here in the venue as well.
I'll be around. Try to talk to me on the right side because it's my left ear that's missing the hearing aid.
No problem at all. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Kate. It's been fantastic.
Thanks for having me.